Hey everybody, how you doing? Today we're going to talk about a couple of more models of judicial decision making. As we move on from the legal model, we'll get into some models that have, in my view, a little more merit, at least scientifically. Specifically, today we're going to talk about the attitudinal model and the strategic model. The reason we talk about them in tandem is because they're kind of similar. The strategic model is building on the attitudinal model in a way, and they're just good at different things. I don't think they're really in competition with one another necessarily, but their similarities mean they're perfect to talk about in tandem. So, what I want to do today is tell you about the attitudinal model. One of its major hallmarks is its predictive power, especially relative to the legal model. And remember, that's very important when it comes to models. They should be predictive. But it has some weaknesses and some very important weaknesses. And the strategic model is a response to the weaknesses of the attitudinal model. So we're going to talk about that as well, talk about its predictive power and some of its weaknesses. No model's perfect. Again, it's just a representation of reality, and some aspects of reality are hard to represent. So the attitudinal model. The sort of major shift from the legal model to the attitudinal model is the attitudinal model stopped listening to judges. It stopped listening to the things they said that influenced their decision making. Judges will always tell you, oh, stare decisis and originalism and precedent and all this stuff really influences the decisions I make. There's no reason to believe that's true. And the attitudinal model moves away from that focus. It stops thinking about why judges argue they behave in a certain way. And instead, it actually focuses on the judges themselves. It changes the focus from their justifications to their actual behavior, because they can misrepresent their justifications, but they can't misrepresent their behavior. This is an important shift because the explanations people give for their behavior are inaccurate often. This includes judges. Now, the justifications they give or the explanations they give could be flat out lies, but we know about implicit biases. We know that people don't always know why they do things, so they may not know why they behave in a certain way. So their explanations for that behavior are necessarily inaccurate. And people are really, really good at rationalizing their behavior. This is sort of in keeping with what I was just saying. They may think they behaved in a certain way for a certain reason. It may not be true, but they sure believe that they did. And again, judges are no different. The whole premise of this class is judges are people too. So the shift from the legal model is an important one. And we start to focus on a different element. And that element is, how do judges actually behave, and what can we learn about the reasons for their behavior based on looking at that behavior itself? So, what shapes decisions according to the attitudinal model? Quite simply, they vote for their attitudes. That's where the term attitudinal comes from. And judges are out there voting for what they want to see enacted into policy. They're voting for their preferred political outcome. Now, let me be a little clear about what an attitude is, because we're going to deviate a little bit, and we're going to talk about ideology. I've already talked a lot so far in this course about how judges are impacted by ideology, but ideology and attitudes are not exactly the same thing. So for the next couple of slides, I'm kind of going to break down the difference between those two and talk about why we look at ideology when we're talking about the attitudinal model instead of attitudes themselves. The simplest reason is because we can generally understand somebody's attitude on a political proposition if we know their ideology. We can't go ask judges about their attitudes all the time because, like the last slide said, they may lie, they may not know. But we can get pretty dang close if we just consider their ideology. So an attitude is a set of interrelated beliefs about an object and the situation in which it is encountered. So the way that we think about, the way that we think about, hello? That was a disaster. I'm sorry. I'm wearing headphones and I started receiving a call and I thought I answered it. Apologies for the interruption. Uh, in attitude, the way that we think about them in the political realm is what does somebody feel about a particular topic? Um, what do they think about, let's say, abortion, or what do they think about affirmative action or something like that? That's generally speaking their attitude on something. Okay. The characteristics of an attitude, they tend to be fairly enduring. People don't often change their minds on attitudes, especially in the political realm. An attitude sort of describes, evaluates, and advocates for action with respect to an object. So again, let's think back to like affirmative action, right? The attitude there is that there's some systematic injustice, and therefore they advocate, somebody who supports correcting that systematic injustice advocates for certain procedures to do so. Attitudes tend to have cognitive, affective, and behavioral components, right? So somebody thinks about it, somebody feels about it, and they usually behave or sort of advocate or do something in relation to that object. So a judge may wish to see abortion made illegal nationwide. They're not going to change their mind on that for the most part. The advocacy there is to use the powers that are given to them by the president and the Senate to change the law in that regard. Okay. Now let's compare this with an ideology. The question here is what shapes attitudes. Well, ideology shapes attitudes. Ideology is sort of, it's a set of beliefs. So it's a set of different attitudes potentially, but ideology sort of shapes those attitudes, at least for some subset of the populace. Definitely for judges. A political ideology is a set of values and feelings through which we see the political world. There's all sorts of different ideologies, religious and all sorts of different types. But the political variant informs what policies we think are appropriate. So for some people, this is not true for everybody. People who don't pay attention to politics, this definitely isn't true. But if you encounter a new idea or a new policy and you've never thought about it before, your judgment about it should be informed by your ideology. So you derive an attitude from your ideology. Okay. In the United States, this is left, right, liberal, conservative. In other countries, it's a little more complex. They have left, right, and sort of up and down, and social and economic policies and things like that. In the U.S., it's usually depicted as one continuum from the left to the right. Now, judges behave in a manner consistent with their ideology. That is the punchline of the attitudinal model. That allows them to vote for their attitudes. Okay, so if they're acting in a manner consistent with their ideology, and their ideology is consistent with their attitudes, which it absolutely should be, they behave in a manner consistent with their ideology. So in simpler terms, conservative justices vote in a conservative manner because they have conservative attitudes. Liberal judges vote in liberal manner because they have liberal attitudes. Okay. Now, ideologies influence any type of ideology, not just political. It's so ingrained, it's a part of us. It structures the way we see the world that people don't even know that that's happening. They don't even understand that they came to a certain policy position because of their ideology. There are various characteristics to an ideology, and all of these characteristics vary by the individual and by the ideology and all of that. But ideologies are generally complex. There's a lot of information to sort of navigate. They're typically consistent. You may know a couple of people who are less liberal than they were before or less conservative than they were before, but there's not a great number of hardcore liberals that end up being hardcore conservatives or vice versa. Ideologies are flexible, though. It's not to say that they're totally immutable. Just because they're complex and consistent doesn't mean they're immutable. They do allow for the incorporation of new information, new life events, that type of thing. So given these characteristics, ideology can influence a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. The assumption of the attitudinal model, and it's a pretty decent assumption to make because this is true of all political actors, is that they're highly affected by their ideology. Their ideology is necessarily complex and consistent because they sort of have the most information and all of that, and they're highly affected by it. Now, this is not always true. There have been some justices over the years that seemed almost entirely unaffected by ideology. Justice Byron White is a pretty good example there. And certain justices are more willing to sort of, cross the center or vote with the other voting bloc because perhaps they're less affected by ideology. So when it comes to ideology and judges, the attitudinal model argues that judges decide cases based on case facts. That's no different than what we see with the legal model. They also use sincere policy attitudes. Okay, now the adjective sincere there is important, and you're going to see why in a second, so hold on to that. And then they use their values. That's another thing that sort of emanates from ideology. So all of those things interact to produce a particular outcome. The argument of the attitudinal model, sort of most simply, is that ideology and particular policy preferences are more important than the law. They're more important than legal training or methods of legal reasoning. They're more important than precedent and all these other things. So liberals are likely to vote together, and so are conservatives. A liberal and a conservative are not likely to vote together. Right? So we can cluster people based on their ideology and sort of predict how they're going to behave. And we can do that because, well, ideology matters more than the other things that might influence a judge. Now, to be clear, the attitudinal model is not saying only ideology influences a judge. Other things matter too. But if we can predict most behavior with a single thing like ideology, the importance of the other features are lessened by quite a bit. So, how do judges decide in the attitudinal model? It depends on their personal goals, what they wish to achieve politically, the rules of the institution. They can't avoid the rules. I mean, they can't always achieve their attitudes, right? The situation, really everything depends on context. If a judge is driven by goals, among all alternatives, they're going to pick the one that yields them the biggest benefit. Okay, so that is what we're talking about here. Is they have a strict preference. Actually, let me skip ahead a couple of slides and explain what that means a little more clearly. Oops, where'd it go? Here we go. So this idea is better conceptualized as having single-peaked preferences. Okay, so what we're looking at on the screen here is three different lines: a blue line, a red line, and a green line. This blue one here, if you follow my cursor, is this sort of triangular one. Like the red one is this sort of skewed triangular one, and the green one's this flat one here. Each of those represents a justice or a judge. And A, B, C, D, and E along the x-axis represent different policies. So in the world of policies that could be chosen, they could pick one of those five. On the y-axis here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's their rank ordering of which outcome along the x-axis they wish to see. So as you can see here, this first justice, the sort of Justice Green here, his preference is policy A, his second preference is B, and all the way down his least preference is E. So he most prefers A, he least prefers E. If we move next to this sort of blue justice here, her most preferred preference is C, her most preferred policy is C. She equally accepts B and D, which are on the opposite sides, and she really doesn't like either A or E, but she's kind of okay with them. She doesn't hate them as much as she could. Finally, this red justice, she really hates A, loves B, and then as we sort of move down to E, less and less. But each of them, as you'll see, only has one. Here we see only has one policy ranked first. Now, as we can see with this justice here, she has 2 policies ranked third, but all of them only have 1 policy ranked first. This is what it means to say among all of the alternatives. Here are the alternatives being these 5 policies down here. Among the alternatives, the attitudinal model suggests that a justice is going to pick the one that yields him or her the greatest benefit. For here, this is these cases, these justices. So for it's A, B, and C for each of them, or for one of them respectively. Okay, so that's what it means to say among the alternatives, they're going to pick the one that they like the most. It means they have single peaked preferences. There's only one thing ranked at number 1. Okay, so let's scroll back a little bit here. So again, among the alternatives, they're going to pick the one that yields them the biggest benefit. And that is based on, their ideology. Their goals are basically achieving their policy preference or their ideology. So how do we know this? Well, let's look at a graph of 37 justices from 1946 to 2006 and how they voted in every case that they voted on. Here on the y-axis, we have the percent of cases where the particular judge or justice voted for the liberal outcome. Each circle in the plotting region represents a judge or justice. Across the x-axis, we have ideology from very liberal all the way to very conservative. And you see it is a very strong correlation. Very liberal justices tend to vote for the liberal outcome somewhere around 90% of the time. Moderate justices, somewhere around 50% of the time. And very conservative justices, it's predicted that it's somewhere around 18% of the time. So what we see here is that the way a justice votes is very much connected to their ideology. So in as much as they're trying to achieve preferences, they can do so by voting in a manner consistent with their ideology. That is the aggregate vote for 37 justices. Let's look at their individual probability of voting in an individual case. So here, we're looking at the probability of voting liberally on the y-axis, and again, justice ideology. Here we see a very similar story. A justice in any given case who happens to be extremely liberal is going to vote liberally 90% of the time, and the extremely conservative justice only about 20% of the time in that same situation. Now, that was based on nearly 80,000 individual justice votes since 1946. Using those 80,000 votes, this graph that I just showed you tells us that ideology explains 93% of the variance in those votes. That's insane. That's a super high number. That is pretty wild. In as much as the world is made up of the systematic and the stochastic, that is pretty systematic. 93% of votes can be explained by ideology. Okay, that is pretty good evidence that ideology is really leading to particular outcomes. So if we consider the legal and the attitudinal models here, right, remember the legal model said that different legal reasoning influenced votes. Well, how can we distinguish different legal reasoning from ideology? As I've said several times, things like originalism are connected to conservatism. So is there a difference? How is there a difference? And furthermore, right, similar to that originalism question, what if legal reasoning is caused by ideology? It very well could be. Legal reasoning is sort of ingrained. It's not fixed, but it's consistent. So if this is true, why is the attitudinal model superior? I want you to kind of mull that over on your own. But for me, the answer is parsimony and explanatory power. It's predictive, whereas the legal model is not predictive. We can use ideology, we can use these values and sort of predict how justice is going to behave. The attitudinal model never suggests that different legal reasonings don't emanate from ideology. All it's saying is that even if that's true, it's still ideology that's causing the votes. Okay. The attitudinal model, despite its superior predictive power over the legal model, is not without its problems. One of them, and this kind of goes back to the last slide, we really don't know what causes ideology. I mean, we know a lot of things that sort of go into it, things like upbringing and genetics, even, and political and legal socialization, like were your parents liberal or conservative? Where'd you go to school? All these types of things. But at the end of the day, ideology is sort of a black box. We can say, oh, ideology influences decision making, but we can't unpack that a little bit more. We'll see throughout this class that there are attempts to unpack it a little bit more, and they've had relative success. But at the end of the day, ideology, despite its crazy predictive power, is still kind of a black box. We don't know how much of the final decision depends on personal preferences. We know that they matter. We know personal preferences, ideology, attitudes, all that matters, but we don't know if it's the whole reason for a vote. We don't know if it's 51% of the reason. We don't know if it's 33% of the reason. So it's hard to say that necessarily ideology is the sole mover of attitudes. And in fact, that might change based on the case, based on the justice, based on how long they've been on the court, and all various types of things like that. Moving on here. Anyhow, the attitudinal model assumes two things. One is sincerity in voting, and the second is that the judge can always obtain preferred policy goals by voting sincerely, right? Those assumptions are definitely false. You'll see why sincerity in voting is definitely false in a moment. But the idea that a judge can always obtain their preferred policy is silly. That's narrow. It'd be narrow-minded of a justice to think, well, I'm going to stick to my guns because to do otherwise violates my values. Well, what if sticking to your guns means you lose, and deviating a little bit means you win? Okay. So the attitudinal model doesn't try to predict behavior in situations where either of these things are true. So it doesn't deal well with insincere or strategic behavior. And this is where the single peak preferences thing comes back in. The judges assume they can get, if they have these single peak preferences, they can sort of have the same amount of utility, but that's obviously not true. So for instance, look here, that this intersection, this policy B, now neither neither Justice Blue here or Justice Green here are getting their preferred policy at B, although red is. It's still their second preferred. So for them to vote at A or C is not a good idea. They should vote for B, and everybody kind of comes to a compromise. The attitudinal model assumes that does not occur. Another big problem with the attitudinal model is really, really good at predicting votes, which what's called merits votes. It's not so good. That's the 93%. It's excellent at merits vote. That's a 93%. It's not so great at predicting other things like setting the agenda. Now, remember when we talked about setting the agenda, there's a little bit of a strategic component there, because if the status quo is liberal, a liberal justice wouldn't want to hear that case. So it doesn't really predict merits voting, or it doesn't predict agenda setting all that well. And we also see that there are some things that are just unrelated to ideology, like how many questions or how aggressively a justice asks questions at oral arguments. So the attitudinal model is great for predicting merits voting. It's not so great at some of the other stuff. And in as much as we want to talk about all of the things that influence various types of judicial behavior, incorporating some other elements beyond the attitudinal model is prudent. And that's where the strategic model comes in. The strategic model is a response to some of the issues of the attitudinal model. The strategic model sort of improves on two of the major issues that the attitudinal model faces. The first being that assumption that judges always obtain a preferred policy by voting sincerely, and the second, it moves beyond just merits voting to provide some predictive accuracy in other areas of judicial behavior. So the strategic model says judges will vote for their attitudes That's the attitudinal model right there, right? Judges will vote for their attitudes. But the strategic model adds, but they're sometimes constrained in their ability to do so. They always want to, but they don't always have the opportunity to do so. So the strategic model says a judge will accept a suboptimal outcome if the optimal outcome is not available. Think back to the single peak preferences. If their single peak, that thing ranked at number 1, is not available, they'll accept the thing ranked at number 2. That's just sort of getting closer to your preferences. You'd rather have something rather than nothing. And the strategic model also asserts that the judges will behave strategically in order to obtain their optimal policy or the suboptimal policy if their optimal outcome is unavailable. So they're not always going to be voting just for their preference. Sometimes they'll vote for something that isn't their preference in a strategic way so they can get closer to their ultimate goal. Another way to say this is a judge might vote counter-attitudinally in order to stop an opponent from achieving his or her goal. Okay, so look at this graph, which is preferences that are not single-peaked. Okay, so look at green justice here, which, if with apologies to the colorblind, if you follow my cursor, you'll know which one I'm talking about here. B and C are equally preferred for this judge. Okay, for this judge, C is the only optimally preferred, but he likes E more than D. That's something we didn't see. This is to say, for the calculus inclined, this is non-monotonic. We didn't see that with the single peaked preferences. So the strategic model does this. It says, well, there aren't single peak preferences because if a strategic judge wants an outcome as close as they can get to their preference, they'll accept suboptimal preferences. And in as much as these are suboptimal, right here, there are 4 outcomes here with which this judge is achieving his or her preferred or second most preferred. That's strategic behavior. Okay. So the important thing to know about the strategic model is it's not replacing anything about the attitudinal model. It agrees almost entirely with the attitudinal model. It's just adding a couple of components. So most of the sort of behavioral motivations of the attitudinal model are present in the strategic model. In my view, the strategic model is just a little bit more realistic. Judges are nuanced. They're savvy political actors. Of course, they're going to be strategic. All political actors are, or at the very least, try to be. The strategic model does a very good job at predicting things like agenda setting, bargaining over the content of a written opinion, and several other things that the attitudinal model cannot account for. It does not, however, offer any predictive power to merits voting. That 93% is based on ideology alone. So what we kind of learn from that is that judges are not very strategic when it comes to voting on the final outcome, because the conclusion is probably a foregone conclusion by then. They would rather be strategic in setting the docket, in creating the legal outcome, that is what's in the written opinion and things like that. So it seems that the justices don't think there's a great deal of utility in being really strategic on merits voting. They think they can get more benefit being strategic in other aspects. Just like the attitudinal model, there are problems with the strategic model. It's not perfect. No model is. The strategic model suffers from a problem that the legal model does as well. Where the legal model assumes mechanical jurisprudence, the strategic model also assumes some level of being a robot, or being able to calculate crazy moves in the future. If there are 9 justices, they have to each play 9-dimensional chess, and everybody's doing that. How does that work? It's hard to figure a situation where, well, I know that he knows that I know that she knows that I'm going to act this way. So instead of that, I'm going to act this way. But if I do that, it can get really complex very quickly. If nobody's acting sincerely, if everybody's trying to figure out a way to achieve his or her preference, and that preference is not necessarily known to anybody but the individual who has that preference. How is every judge going to figure out what the other one's going to do? It's really hard. Um, Another thing is it's hard to decide if a behavior was strategic or somebody just kind of screwed up at being sincere, like they did a bad job at being sincere, and it just might look like they're being strategic. So there might be some observational equivalence there. So these are some of the problems with the strategic model. But nevertheless, the strategic model does a really good job at predicting things like agenda setting. And we've already talked about that a little bit. I will note that the vast majority of the work we read in the remainder of the semester operates in the strategic model tradition. Most of the work assumes that judges are strategic, that they are trying to achieve their policy preferences, that they will do as much as they can to achieve them, but they will accept suboptimal outcomes. That's just sort of the groundwork for everything we're going to talk about. So the strategic model ends up being a sort of important step in this class and in the history of judicial politics research because, well, everybody assumes they're pretty strategic. We will get to a point in the semester where that may not be so true, and I'll be sure to note that departure when we get there. But for now, that's the attitudinal and the strategic models. Hope you learned something.